This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And by the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. As a nonprofit, we rely on support from listeners like you. If you like what you hear, please consider a donation. To learn more and make a gift, visit us at www.gosuperior.org.
I'm Walt Lindala.
And I'm Frida Waara.
And welcome once again to the Lake Superior podcast. It's stories from around the Great Lake, and it's brought to you by the folks at the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. So, Frida, we've got an interesting one here today, talking about a little more in-depth with the Apostle Islands. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, first of all, we're getting that spring fever. The snow is starting to melt, maybe a little bit. We don't know exactly how fast that's happening, but certainly I am sleeping with the door open. Mm-hmm. That usually doesn't happen yet this time of year. And I'm hearing the bird song. And it made me really think about the birds that are migrating back to this beautiful basin of the Lake Superior region that we have. And there's no one better to talk with about that than Peggy Burkman, because I wanted to have this interview for such a long time. I've heard a lot about her, and more than anything, because she is the expert on the piping plover.
So let's talk about that a little bit with Peggy Burkman, who is biologist with the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. Welcome to the podcast, Peggy.
Well, thanks for having me.
We appreciate you joining us this for this a few moments. But you know what we'd like to do with our guests is find out first, before we get into some of the specific topics, is a little bit about yourself. Can you give us sort of an overview of your career? Maybe just tell us a little bit how you got where you are, and have you always been a biologist with the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore?
Sure. I have worked for the federal government for 30 years, but I actually started with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at Seney National Wildlife Refuge, which is in the Upper Peninsula. I did my master's there, and then I took a job down at Minnesota Valley National Wildlife Refuge in the Twin Cities, and pretty quickly realized I'm not a big cities person. So I took a job back in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and I worked for the Hiawatha National Forest. First I was a fire ecologist and then a landscape ecologist. And then I started here in the winter of 2002.
Okay, so you've been there for quite a while, probably seen some interesting things, which I know will get into it. But what has been some of the interesting parts of as a national park, in particular a unit of islands? This covers a lot of variety and species. There must be some interesting trends and challenges and maybe some interesting things you've just experienced. Tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, the park is really interesting. I mean, it's 21 islands in Lake Superior and a mainland unit, and each island is really different because, I mean, they all have, a different expression of a list of vegetation and, different natural features. But then the islands have been used by Native American folks for centuries, and there's been different cultural history as well. So, logging on some islands, but not all islands. Lighthouses on some islands, quarrying on a couple islands. So each island really is interesting in its own right, and it's 21 little stories is the way I like to think about it.
Yeah. And Peggy, then how did this little shorebird end up being kind of top on the list of what your job is as a biologist there?
So the Great Lakes piping plover is a federally endangered species. And honestly, I mean, we're legally required to protect them. But, it's also the right thing to do because every species contributes to biodiversity. And also, piping plovers are considered to be what's known as an indicator species, and that just means that their presence on the landscape signals that the habitat that they're in is healthy, and that benefits everybody, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. So can you describe one for us, a little bit about it, like how it looks and acts? Where can we expect perhaps to find them?
Sure. So I'm a birder, so I love birds, and of course they're cute. They are a small sandy-colored shorebird. They've got orange legs. Their underparts are white, and their face is white. But they also have like these black bands across their head and around their neck. And these features are more obvious in males during the breeding season. Their bill is kind of stubby, and their eyes are a little bit large because they are visual foragers, and they probe the sand for invertebrates and worms and that type of thing. And it creates kind of like a start and stop type of a movement as they're, moving down the shoreline. And you can actually identify them in part because of the way that stop and start, method of moving. And, they basically spend their life on beaches, both, during the nesting time and then when they're wintering down in the south part of the country.
But they've been threatened.
Yes, it's been quite a while in coming, too. I mean, the species was listed as endangered in 1986, I believe, and it's, in part because there's been a lot of habitat loss over time, and then there's also conflict with, people and dogs are a big issue. And so, like a lot of rare species, I mean, that's kind of common. They face multiple issues, but also, those types of species tend to be kind of, honestly, picky in their, nesting requirements. So it's kind of a complicated, long story,
So tell us a little bit then in terms of the work that you do as biologists with the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore in terms of working with these birds, working with this population. What is some of the work that you do?
Well, and first of all, I want to acknowledge that I work with several partners as part of the Great Lakes Piping Plover team, and I work most closely here with the Bad River Band of Lake Superior Chippewa Tribe, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Wisconsin DNR. And, in the winter we do a lot of reporting and planning up the next season and making sure that we have funding. And then in the spring, we're making sure that seasonal piping plover monitors are getting hired and that, we provide them training and we get them set up to be able to stay out on Long Island. And, I mean, piping plovers can be arriving in early May. And, we need to get those monitors out there to make sure to watch the birds. And the other role they serve is to educate the public on, the fact that the birds are there, that they're endangered, and that, they need to be, basically people need to share the beach. And then the other thing that happens is the monitors will keep an eye on the adults, and you can tell by their behavior if they've set up a nest. And if that happens, then we put up what's an exclosure over the nest, and then also what we call psychological fencing, and that's just basically signs and twine, and it closes off a small area. It's probably maybe 100 yards long, and it's between the beach and the grass behind the beach. So however deep the beach is, that kind of limits how big this space is that way. It's very seasonal. I mean, it changes, throughout the year, depending on the time.
Sure.
Just give us an idea when you talk about a monitor. So that's someone that's living on Long Island for like overnight or weeks at a time. Are they camping?
Right.
Are they in a tent?
Right. So, we hire 2 monitors. And actually Bad River does the hiring and the supervision and, the transports and all of that. And, the folks have actually a pretty nice setup. It's a very nice, large wall tent. And they, we look for people that have some birding skills, and we, provide them training on specific behaviors to look for to indicate, a given pair, 2 birds have paired up, or they're, starting to copulate, or they're, setting up a nest, or whatever stage they're at. It's an interesting job, I think. That's the only place we have, monitors stay overnight.
So I'm curious, and we're talking with Peggy Burkman here on the podcast today, who's a biologist with Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, about the piping plover. And I'm curious, Peggy, from the standpoint of, obviously you get busy then as you start getting into the springtime. I'm sure that's really when things start to ramp up. But then what changes from some of that more administrative and that type of work to when you're actually starting to get, in effect, your boots on the ground?
Well, basically, the adults can arrive like at the beginning of May, or, usually they're definitely here by mid-May. Once they're here, that's pretty much when we want to have people out on the ground. And so there's kind of 2 aspects of this, too, because we have, piping plover monitors staying on Long Island, and Bad River folks kind of managing the day-to-day of that. But then on several other islands in the park, Stockton, Michigan, and Outer Islands, myself and my seasonal staff are checking those islands to make sure, we're finding any adults that have, decided to set up shop at a different location. The last 4 years, they've been at Outer Island, and Apostle Island spreads out over 280,000 acres, and so there's a fair bit of travel to get to these, sites, and Lake Superior does not always cooperate.
Yes, we know that.
Yes. These are like parallel efforts that are going on at the same time. I could not do all of it. It's just it would just be too much. So I'm very grateful for the relationship we have with Bad River folks and the efforts that they put into this project.
There was a term you used for this bird in terms of being sort of it showcased that something was good or bad with the climate and its surroundings. Tell me about that a little bit more. Why is it important to keep an eye on this bird? Well,
I think I was talking about the fact that they're an indicator species.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. And, there's several different indicator species, and specific for the piping plover, it's a rare bird, right? So that's one thing. But then they also eat invertebrates and, these aquatic worms, and they're found they are usually foraging like right along the shoreline. And so that's wetlands, Lake Superior, there's different things that can indicate health of that system. And invertebrates and aquatic worms and things can pretty quickly accumulate different, chemicals or things like that. And because the birds are eating them, it can, if there's, something in the lake or in that insect and they're eating it, it can definitely impact their health. And so that's one of those situations where it's, kind of like a food web type thing. And so having those rare species that are doing well in an area, is kind of an indicator that, there's several indicators, but it's one of, many indicators that, a system is doing okay.
Peggy, you used the word rare. How many, say, mating pairs? Because I did do a little research, and plovers are monogamous, so
Yes.
they're going to stay mated for life. How many pairs do we have, or estimates of?
Right. So just for the Great Lakes population, we had 73 pairs last year.
73.
And it's been running right along in that area for the past few years. There is an Atlantic coast population of piping plovers, and then there's a prairie pothole region population. But the Great Lakes population is the only one that is considered endangered because of those low numbers. And honestly, I would have to look up the numbers for those other populations.
Sure.
But 72 is not very much.
No, it's not.
And you also use the word, Peggy, picky. So, doggone it, that we're trying to help these birds and they're just darn picky. When you say that, what is it about where they nest and how rare it is to find them? We already know the numbers are low, but also the places that they want to nest seem to be really rare.
Right. And so at the park, what piping plovers are looking for, and actually anywhere they're going to nest, is they would like a wide sandy beach because they don't want trees near behind where an aerial predator could, be sitting and watching them. They like a certain amount of cobble or, just pebbles, stones on the beach because they lay their eggs on the ground, and their eggs are very camouflaged, and they'll, they don't really construct a typical nest like a lot of birds do. I mean, basically, the male will just basically scrape a little depression in the land, and they may or may not add some pebbles. Some of them line their nests very, very in a really detailed way, and some of them just kind of do a less serious job, so that is important. And they are also looking for habitat that the beach needs to be wide enough that their nest isn't going to get washed out. There needs to be enough shoreline edge where there's food sources for them. I mean, they definitely are driven to find quiet beach areas, but of course, people also like beaches. And not only has there been a lot of habitat loss over time, and that's probably the biggest problem facing them, but then in a more day-to-day type of a situation, it's they might be much more likely to be impacted by human disturbance, and I think I mentioned dogs too as being a big deal.
Yeah. And I want to take up on that a little bit. Peggy Burkman is with us on the program here today, biologist with Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. You're talking about threats like, there's the animals, there's humans, people want to go to the beach. Beaches themselves sometimes seem to be shrinking a little bit. Is this a climate change related thing? I mean, if you're here on Lake Superior, the beaches can change from year to year. And sometimes it seems like we've got more storms coming in that are washing a lot of this. How big of a threat is something like climate change in this conversation?
Honestly, I would rank it fairly high. In our area, climate change is increasing temperatures, waves on the lake, rainstorms, and it's kind of crazy to think about that even though, Lake Superior is the largest inland lake globally, but yet it's among the fastest warming globally. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the water is warming faster than the air, and this actually reduces a historical temperature gradient between the two, and as a result of that, some researchers over in Duluth found that wind speeds in the lake are increasing, and they have been since the mid-1980s. And it's like at a rate of 5% per decade, this increase.
Mm-hmm.
And so, increasing waves can flood out piping plover nests, and that is definitely worse when the lake levels are higher for, a few years. And honestly, about 6 or 8 years ago, I think this was the primary reason that plovers in the park started checking out other islands to nest, because prior to that, they had been nesting on Long Island for, over like 15, 20 some odd years, pretty, consistently. And so, yeah, I think it's pretty important. The other thing, you mentioned rain events.
Mm-hmm.
And in the past 11 years, during the plover nesting season, we've had several times where, the nests were washed out. And thankfully, the piping plovers are adapting to that, and they will usually re-nest. And so they basically, are abandoning their original nest, but then they move back. And a lot of times they go as far away from the shoreline as they can.
Mm-hmm.
And,
sure.
And they'll set up a second nest. And most of the time, unless that nest is, taken by a predator, they're successful.
Peggy, you mentioned that all of these islands in the Apostles are so different. And I've been very fortunate to kayak many, many of them. I've not been to Long Island, but I did do a little research,. And some of our listeners may not realize that Long Island really is long.
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe about 4 miles long, but it's more of, you gave me the word. Is it kind of a sand spit? It's not necessarily, even is there a tree on all of Long Island?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So one of the things that Apostles is known for are its sandscapes. And sandscapes that's a general term that it applies to basically these sandy landforms. And they form over time, and they have different shapes, and they're basically named mostly because of the shape that they take. And so Long Island, it is very narrow and very long, and it's a barrier spit. And the Chequamegon Bay is behind Long Island, and Long Island provides, a fair amount of protection to the Chequamegon Bay in terms of, preventing those waves and things from making it all the way to the shore, unless the wind is so strong it's picking up behind the lake, behind the island, and being able to carry over the distance between there and the mainland. It's and it is forested. There's more at the tip. It's I would say primarily forested, except for there is a sandy beach area. But down where the piping plovers are nesting, it's first of all narrower down there, but it's also mostly there's a nice beach, and then there's a nice big area of beach grass and pretty open, and then there is a strip of forest again. It's definitely a cool place.
Well, I'm just curious now, when we're talking about like you said, 72, 73 pairs of the piping plovers in this region on the Lake Superior. Now, what are you thinking potentially we may see next year? And then also tying into that with this effort to observe them, are you still looking for volunteers? And if people want to help, what's a good way to do that? But what do you think you're going to see in the next year here?
I'm thinking it's probably going to be pretty similar. it's been 72, 73, 70 for the past few years. It's a slow but continual increase over the long term. And, that's fine. As long as it's a positive, we're happy with that. And as far as volunteers, we actually use paid staff for this work because, we want folks to have a certain background and there's a fair bit of training required. And so, people can still help, though. The way they can is that, it's really important for people to learn about piping plovers and other shorebirds and be willing to, share the beaches during that few months that's required for their nesting and, respect the closed areas and respect, the fact that, dogs are required to be on a leash in the park, and keeping them away from shorebirds is, if you're walking on a beach and you're seeing shorebirds, they're usually feeding or doing something that is, important to their livelihood, so to speak. And so energy spent, maybe running from a dog off leash is, they're not eating, they're not, doing things to maintain themselves. So those are all really important. And, we have the one thing that's great about Apostle Islands is we have a lot of repeat visitors, and they'll come up to the monitors in the summer and they'll ask, how are the piping plovers? So, it's, learn and share the information. I mean, that always helps.
Peggy, you've been at this for a while, and I just love your energy for it. Is there a particular part of your job that you just can't wait for every year?
Oh, you know what? Plover Chick Banding Day, absolutely my favorite.
Now, I got to think about this. You've got a little bird that basically is like a little chick in your palm of your hand, and you're trying to band this little critter. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So we've been working with Sumner Madison. He's the state avian ecologist since I've been here to band chicks. And you're right. I mean, they are just little tiny fluff balls with legs and definitely adorable. And we capture them when they're about 8 to 14 days old. And that's because if they get older than that, we can't catch them.
Sure. Of course.
Right. They're just too fast. And when we are, capturing them to band them, they weigh between 10 and 20 grams. And so that's like the weight of about 4 nickels.
Mm-hmm.
Not much at all. And, I love Plover Chick Banding Day. It's a lot of fun. Everybody's always really, in a good mood. And banding's important because there's a Great Lakes Piping Plover recovery plan. And that has been in place for several years. And as part of that, they want 150 pairs in the Great Lakes. And, how do you know if you have 150 pairs if you can't tell them apart?
All right.
And so, we are helping that overall recovery goal by providing just a simple identification, And, Sumner's excellent at what he does, and I get to hold the chicks, and he gets to band them. And I have the best job.
Yeah, I was going to say, that seems to be like a lot of fun. Now, as we wrap up here with you today, Peggy, I want to ask if people want to find out more about this work, that plan, maybe they want to see a little bit about what you do. Is there some place, maybe the Apostle Islands, do they have a resource center of some type or a website or something to see a little bit more about these efforts?
Sure. So, as far as the Great Lakes Piping Plover, actually, if you just type that into the internet, you're probably going to find, the Great Lakes Piping Plover management team. They have a website. We have I'm pretty sure our website has some information about the piping plovers.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing that we try to do every year, because it's fun, is, the park has a a Facebook page, and, when we've got chicks coming out into the, into the world, I make sure that people know about that happening, and we put a Facebook post up. We'll put, if we have recordings, excuse me, or photos or whatever, we've collected, we'll share that with the public. And I try to do it so, if somebody was actually paying attention, they would, know when the adults arrived, when the first nests were set up, when the first chicks were hatched, when we banded, and when they fledged,
Sure.
So the whole season we try to just share the joy.
Well, look for it on Facebook then, I'm sure. Peggy, we've really had a good time talking with you about this. We learned so much by doing this podcast, and you've taught us about some very important friends and cohabitants of this lake that really are important to us, and we want to thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you, and I really appreciate the fact that you gave me the time to talk about piping plovers to a broader audience.
That's Peggy Burkman, who is a biologist with the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, talking about the piping plover. And I know the bird she's talking about, because if you spend some time on the Lake Superior shoreline, you'll see them, that darting start and stop down by the water, But I never really looked at them, Frida, as I didn't know what you called them, an indicator species, that when you see them, it's a good sign. And that's why it's important to make sure they stick around.
And to say 73 mating pairs, that's all that we have, at least in the Great Lakes that we can, know about. There's certainly places that they might go to, but as Peggy explained, they are picky, picky, picky. So when you see them, oh my goodness, please.
Yeah, let
everything
them be.
we can do. Yeah, right. Yeah. And, I'm so guilty of that. Walt, I've got 2 galumpuses that run the beach, and thankfully, I know our beach pretty well. I've not seen any nest because we've got a lot of those tall trees. And the reason that those birds don't like those trees is because that's where the hawks and the eagles are. And
exactly.
They don't want them after the eggs.
It's important to just treat these animals, our friends, our cohabitants around the big lake with respect. And it's always a pleasure, too, when we get to talk with somebody that has that kind of interest in it.
Yeah.
That's been really good. That's going to wrap it up for us here on this latest edition of the Lake Superior podcast. But if you do have an idea, maybe there's something you'd like to hear us talk about, reach out to the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. They'll get the information to us, and we'll see what we can do. But that's going to do it for another edition of the program. I'm Walt Lindala.
I'm Frida Waara. Thanks for listening.
This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And by the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. As a nonprofit, we rely on support from listeners like you. If you like what you hear, please consider a donation. To learn more and make a gift, visit us at www.gosuperior.org.